Hello there. Welcome back to Obscura Revelation. I'm here to help you find peace in the dark. Before we begin, make yourself a warm drink of your choice and make yourself comfortable. Notice the weight of the day you've been carrying, perhaps in your shoulders or in that tight space behind your eyes. It's been there so long you've stopped feeling it, haven't you? But it's there. A companion you never asked for. I know many of you listen to these stories to drift off, so before you get too cozy, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It truly helps our small corner of the dark grow. Let the edges of your room soften into the dark. There is nothing you need to fix, nothing you need to solve, and nothing you need to manage right now. In the comments, if you'd like, share one small thing that brought you a moment of peace today. A cup of coffee that was the right temperature, a song on the radio, the way the light hit your wall. Now, take a deep breath and let us begin. Let me tell you about Dr. Mara Kearney. The stormwater lab did not look haunted. It looked exhausted, the way old infrastructure sags when no one is really watching. Concrete corridors, beige paint leached toward gray, humming pipes threaded through the ceiling like exposed veins, forever pulsing in a slow mechanical breath. The air smelled faintly of algae and cold metal, a dampness that never quite left, even on dry days, even when the rain outside had not touched the city for a week. Everywhere, laminated flood maps curled at the corners, pinned to corkboards, their bright blues and yellows fading under fluorescent lights that flickered just enough to irritate the eyes, never enough to trigger maintenance. Dr. Mara sat alone at her desk, the only light in the monitoring room a rectangle of screen glow, soft and intrusive, painting her face in tired pixels. On the wall behind her, a digital panel traced real-time flows through the city's drains, a nervous system of moving numbers, cubic meters per second, red alerts that almost never came. No drama, she would tell new hires, smiling as she handed them induction forms. Stormwater is about prevention, not catastrophe. If we do it right, nothing happens at all. On paper, she was stable, respected, a senior hydrologist trusted to sign off on risk, on design, on the fine print mathematics that decided how much water the city could survive. Tonight, her mask of normalcy was a warm mug of tea and an open spreadsheet, little green cells marching in perfect order, like proof that the world could still be organized. She tabbed between models, adjusting coefficients with tiny controlled movements, pretending not to notice the knot in her stomach that tightened every time her cursor hovered over the word acceptable. Acceptable risk, acceptable overflow, acceptable likelihood of failure, as if lives could be managed like runoff. In community meetings, she would stand at the projector, laser pointer steady, voice smooth, as she described 1 in 100-year storms, probabilities, mitigation, the language of calm. "How do you sleep knowing this?" an older man had asked her once after a public consultation. "Oh, very well," she had replied, smiling. "It's just pipes and math. Honestly, it's boring." The audience had laughed politely, relieved, grateful to have the fear translated into numbers, into something unthreatening they could file away and forget. But when the room emptied, when the lights dimmed and the hum of conversation drained from the hall, she had stayed behind, staring at the residual flood maps like they were crime scene photos. The lab was almost silent now, the city above muffled by concrete and distance, The only sounds the slow, patient respiration of the building itself. Pumps cycling in distant chambers, a low, continuous drone beneath her, like a whale song heard through stone, punctuated by the occasional metallic click as valves adjusted, unseen. Far down the corridor, there was a dripping tap in the old sampling room, a slow, steady patter that had become part of the lab's heartbeat months ago. Mara's colleagues joked that it was soothing, like rain on a roof, but she had never found it comforting. To her, it sounded like counting. On the desk beside her keyboard lay a small battered field recorder, city issue, its sticker half peeled, its buttons rubbed shiny with use. She had finished cataloging the day's site samples hours earlier, logging turbidity, temperature, trace pollutants, the clean empirical part of the job. By any sensible measure, the day was over, the data safe, the work complete, and yet the recorder stayed there, just at the edge of her vision, like an unopened letter. Her hand moved to it without thinking, fingers resting on the scarred plastic, thumb tracing the groove where the casing had cracked last winter. It had cracked during a storm inspection when she slipped on a slick concrete lip and smacked the recorder against the side of a culvert. That night, rain had hammered so loudly on the city that her voice notes were almost entirely drowned out. More than once, she had to shout to hear herself on playback. Later, reviewing the file at home, alone, she had noticed the first anomaly, small enough to dismiss, sharp enough to lodge under her skin. She had called down an echo in the culvert, testing acoustics, checking for blockages, and the word that came back was not the one she sent. "Discharge," she had said, voice echoing down the concrete throat, the word bouncing and thinning as it traveled. On the recording, after the hiss of rain and the roar of water, the echo returned. But the consonants were wrong, rearranged, softened into something that sounded like forgive, static, interference, she had told herself, a trick of overlapping reflections, noise, smashing syllables together, nothing mystical at all. She had almost convinced herself, almost, until the same pattern appeared on another file and another, and then she stopped counting. The folklore calls it a fetch, she remembered suddenly, a double that appears as an omen, a ghost of the living that arrives before the death it announces. Her grandmother's voice drifted up from a childhood, half-forgotten stories about seeing your own self across the road at dusk, and knowing you would not walk it much longer. Mara had grown up, moved to the city, learned calculus and fluid dynamics, and left those stories behind with the smell of peat smoke and wet wool. Now, sitting alone in a fluorescent humming room, surrounded by hazard maps and mechanical breathing, she realized how often she had been listening to an echo of herself. She lifted the recorder, feeling its weight, the tiny rattle inside where something had come loose, the way it warmed quickly in her palm. Her finger hovered over the play button, hovering in that small private space between rational work and the things she did not write in any report. Every time she pressed that button, she told herself it was for analysis, for quality control, for acoustic survey, a professional curiosity. But tonight, as the lab breathed around her, she understood that what she really wanted was not data, but an answer. She exhaled slowly, shoulders dropping a fraction, then pressed play. The recording began with rain, even though the night outside the lab was dry, the sky above the city clear and sharp with winter stars. On the tiny speaker, the storm roared on, relentless, a curtain of white noise that filled the monitoring room with ghost weather. Behind it, underneath it, there was the rhythmic thud of her own footsteps from months ago, echoing in the hollow spaces of the culvert. The sound of water crashing against concrete walls rose and fell, a mechanical tide, regular and indifferent, as if the drains were breathing in long, slow cycles. Site 7, downstream junction inspection, her recorded voice said, slightly tinny, the professional cadence intact even through distortion. Flow elevated, visible turbulence at merge, sampling for potential cross-connection. She remembered the moment, remembered the cold spray on her face, the way her waterproofs had stuck to her skin, the sense that the entire city's runoff was rushing around her ankles. On the recording, she heard herself walk closer to the opening, boots scraping, then the soft click of her thumb over the pause button, hesitating. "I'm just going to check the echo profile," her past self murmured, hardly more than a breath, as if embarrassed to admit it. She drew in air, loud enough to register, then called into the roaring dark, "Discharge!" The word vanished down the concrete tunnel, whisked away by the storm, and for a moment there was nothing but the hammer of water. Then, faint and delayed, there came the return, an echo that should have been a blurred reflection of the original, yet was not. "Give," the recorder whispered, almost lost under the rain, a frayed syllable that resolved itself into "forgive," if you leaned toward it, if you allowed it. Mara paused the playback, heart ticking louder in her chest, aware of the absurdity of holding her breath in an empty room. She had heard this before, many times, had explained it away as destructive interference, as frequency masking, as a kind of sonic pareidolia. Her rational mind lined up reasons like dominoes, cheap microphone, wind gusts, her own expectations bending the sound into meaning. She resumed the file. On the recording, she moved further in, the storm's roar deepening, the acoustics shifting as the culvert narrowed. Her voice came again, closer to the concrete now. "Check for surcharge," a phrase she used 100 times a year without thinking. The echo that crawled back, thin and stretched, sounded like, "You heard?" 3 dislocated syllables sliding over one another. The hair on her arms rose, the room suddenly feeling smaller, the pump drone under the floor louder, more insistent. "This is nothing," she muttered, to the empty lab, to herself, to the invisible audience she imagined hovering just beyond the black of the screen. "Just noise, just physics. I'm literally paid to know better." She snorted softly, tried to laugh, the sound coming out brittle, then scrubbed forward in the track, searching for the moment that had kept her awake these last few months. It occurred toward the end, after she had finished the inspection, after she had logged the required notes, a section she had not meant to record at all. The rain on the file began to soften, the storm easing as she walked away from the culvert mouth. Her footsteps slowed, her breathing, picked up by the mic, sounded heavier, as if the waterproof gear weighed more with every step. There was a long, unprofessional silence, the kind that should have been edited out before archiving. Then her own voice, small and unbecomingly human, slipped through the static. "I did everything right," Past Mara whispered, not as a note, not as data, but as a confession to no one. There was another empty beat, long enough for regret to take shape, and then, softer still, "I did everything the model said." In the recording, the storm gave one last gust, water roaring, as if the sky itself were taking a breath to answer. What came back from the darkness did not sound like her anymore. The echo was delayed longer than it should have been, as if it had gotten lost in some unseen chamber before finding its way out. When it arrived, it did not mirror her words. Instead, the culvert returned a low, elongated syllable that no model could predict. Why? The echo exhaled, barely formed, not quite speech, but unmistakably shaped like a question. Mara stopped the playback, thumb jamming the button, heat flushing through her chest as if someone had just accused her aloud. The scent came then, sharp, unmistakable, the smell of blown-out matches, that peculiar mix of sulfur and extinguished flame. It threaded through the monitoring room on no discernible draft, impossible in the sealed, stale air of the underground lab. She turned in her chair, eyes scanning the corners, the overhead pipes, the closed door, as if she might catch some rational cause in the act. There was nothing, only the same old concrete, the same panels and maps, static and patient and utterly disinterested. This is stress, she told herself, words clipped, therapist clean, the diagnostic language she had learned to apply to her own spirals. You've been working doubles. You haven't taken a proper weekend. You're just imprinting. Her mind reached for formal terms, for survey methodology, for acoustic anomalies and complex drainage networks, anything that would pin the wrongness to a pinboard like evidence. The smell lingered for a few more seconds, then thinned, dissolving into the ambient chill, leaving only the mechanical breathing of the pumps. She clicked to the next file. This one was from a dry weather inspection, months after the flood that had drowned the lower streets near the river. Casualties had been low, officially, only a handful, mostly older residents and one child whose name she had read in a report and not spoken aloud since. She had run simulations later, alone in the lab, long after the city moved on, and found that a different design, a more expensive diversion, might have changed where the water went. Not how much fell, not that it rose, but which doorsteps it chose to visit. On the recording, her boots clicked on a dry concrete. No storm roar this time, just a distant hum of traffic above the manholes. Post-event survey, minimal debris, no visible structural compromise. Her professional voice intoned. Her tone was so calm, so precise, that it made her present-day stomach twist. She sounded like someone reading a weather forecast. There was a pause, the faint scrape of her sleeve against the recorder casing as she lifted it closer to her mouth. "I'm doing this for security," her past self said quietly, off script, the phrase slipping out like an excuse she had rehearsed for a different audience. Security for the city, she had meant. Infrastructure security, public safety, all the grand rationales she had leaned on when approving cheaper options, faster fixes. On the track, the drains around her sat empty. No water to carry her words, yet an echo still formed, a thin, airy reflection that should not have existed in such stillness. Curity. It sighed back, truncating the word, twisting it, making it sound like surety, like a cruel little question about what she was actually sure of. "I'm doing this for security," she repeated now in the present to the empty lab, the phrase tasting flatter each time. Her chest felt tight, as if the room's air pressure had changed, though the instruments on the wall showed nothing unusual. She pinched the bridge of her nose, eyes closing for a second, letting the mechanical hum of the building wash over her. It sounded, suddenly, like a slow metallic breathing, in, out, in, identical cycles. indifferent to human distress. The first visual fracture came as she opened her eyes. In the glass of the monitoring panel, her reflection stared back at her. Same dark hair pulled into a low knot, same tired eyes, same city logo fleece zipped to the throat. For a moment, it was perfectly normal, a simple mirror in the black screen of inactive graphs. Then, as she tilted her head to stretch her neck, her reflected head did not move. It lagged a fraction of a second behind, as if considering whether to follow. She froze, breath halting in her throat, watching the glass, waiting for a glitch, a flicker, a power fluctuation she could file in a maintenance request. The fluorescent lights hummed on, steady. The pumps thrummed below. The dripping tap down the corridor kept its patient time. She lifted a hand slowly, fingers spread, and watched as her reflection lifted its own. Just a beat late, the delay so tiny it could have been a trick of attention. "Sleep," she murmured, forcing a laugh. "You need sleep. This is just neural latency." The reflection smiled a fraction wider than she did. She blinked hard, and when she opened her eyes, the glass showed only herself again, perfectly synchronized, perfectly mundane. Her heart banged against her ribs too loud, threatening to drown out the ambient hum with its own frantic tempo. "Okay," she said to the room, to the invisible fetch of herself that folklore promised as a warning. "Okay, we're not doing that." She turned away from the panel, gripping the recorder like a talisman, and forced herself to focus on the concrete, the real, the measurable, the controllable. The lab seemed to lean closer as she walked down the corridor toward the old sampling room. Here, the mechanical breathing of the building grew louder, the pipes in the walls throbbing with unseen flows, like someone sleeping uneasily inside the structure. The dripping tap was clearer here, each drop hitting the metal sink with a plink that began to feel uncomfortably like a metronome. As she stepped into the doorway, the pattern seemed to shift, drops spacing themselves in little clusters, as if trying to match the rhythm of her heartbeat. "This is still just physics," she insisted, moving to the sink, inspecting the faucet with exaggerated care, searching for lime scale, a loose washer, some defects she could fix. She found nothing out of the ordinary, just the same corroded metal she had seen 100 times, the same rust stain on the basin. She tightened the tap anyway, twisting it until the dripping stopped, breaking the rhythm with a small, satisfying squeak of resistance. The silence that followed was so sudden it made her ears ring. Then, from somewhere deep in the pipes, out of sync with her action, a single drop fell. It landed with a hollow, amplified tick that did not belong to such a small sound, echoing too long in the metal throat of the drain. She stared at the sink, at the dry tap, at the still basin, listening as the echo's tail faded in a way that suggested a larger space behind the walls than any blueprint supported. Her mind conjured images of hidden chambers, forgotten junctions, spaces where the city's runoff collected in stagnant pools, storing more than just sediment. She pictured the faces from the post-flood reports, reflected in brown, standing water, their lives reduced to statistics under her signature. "I did everything right," she said again, voice barely above a whisper, repeating the line from the recording as if it were a spell. The pipes around her vibrated softly, a subsonic murmur that made the hair at the back of her neck rise. For a moment, the building seemed to inhale, and in that held breath, in that narrow space between sound and silence, something in the unseen plumbing decided that it was time to answer. From deep within the walls, not from any specific pipe she could point to, came a low composite murmur. It was not speech, not at first. It was conveyors and culverts and junctions, the rush of captured rain and misdirected gray water, all the anonymous flows she had spent a career quantifying. But as it passed through bends and convergences, as it threaded itself through rust and residue, the noise took on a pattern. Not words, not yet, but a rhythm that matched the trembling of her own pulse, a mimicry of her internal storm. Mara stepped back, the recorder lifting almost of its own accord, her thumb brushing the button, capturing this new sound out of reflex. She told herself that this was just another data set, an anomaly to be studied, a glitch in the infrastructure. Inside, a quieter voice, one she had been ignoring for years, observed calmly that she was now treating her own fear like an outfall, a problem to be monitored, not faced. The building exhaled, a long, slow shudder of distant machinery, and the mechanical breathing settled again into its steady, unhurried rhythm. She stood there, in the humming half-dark of the sampling room, with the recorder warm in her hand and the taste of blown-out matches still ghosting at the back of her throat. The rational narrative, security, prevention, acceptable risk, hung around her like a lab coat she had outgrown. Down in the drains, beneath the city, the water moved in its blind, unjudging circuits, indifferent to models, yet brutally honest about consequences. And somewhere in that echoing maze, something had started to speak in her own voice, asking questions she could not file away. She turned the recorder off, but kept holding it, as if the plastic shell might anchor her. Behind her eyes, the delayed reflection from the monitoring panel replayed itself, that fractional lag between her and her own image. Folklore insisted that a fetch was not punishment, not judgment, but a warning, a simple fact delivered in the shape of yourself. Standing alone in the breathing lab, Mara understood, with a clarity that hurt, that the thing she was most afraid to face was not in the pipes at all. It was in the gap between what she told herself and what the echoes knew. For a long time, Mara just stood in the humming dark of the sampling room, the recorder heavy in her hand, the pipes breathing around her like a patient that refused to wake. Her thoughts did not feel like clean, rational lines anymore. They felt like runoff, finding every crack, every low place she had tried not to see. When she finally moved, it was not decisive or heroic. It was small, almost clumsy, the way people move when they are more tired than they have ever admitted. She stepped back to the sink, resting the recorder on the rim, as if offering it to the old porcelain, as if asking the basin itself for an opinion. For the first time that night, she did not reach for an equation. She did not tell herself that this was about security or probability or acceptable risk. Instead, she let the memory come, unedited, the one she always turned away from when she looked at the post-flood map. She saw the red outline of the inundation zone, the way the color crept over one particular street, crossing a thin black line that marked a small unnamed side road. She saw the dot on the report, just a dot, just a coordinate, where the child had lived. And she remembered the meeting months before, when she had been asked if there was any cheaper way to handle that catchment, any compromise that would still be within tolerance. She had said yes. The model had backed her up. The budget had thanked her. The room seemed to lean in gently, as if the building itself were listening. Mara, The narrator's voice softens here, dropping almost to a whisper. You did not set out to hurt anyone. You did what you were trained to do. You followed the rules you were given. You carried the weight the system handed you, and you tried to carry it alone. A long, slow breath. But the pain you feel is not imaginary. The guilt that knots in your chest, the way you cannot look at those maps without tasting metal in your mouth, that is real. You are not weak for feeling it. You are not broken for wanting it to stop. She gripped the edge of the sink, knuckles whitening as if she needed the cold ceramic to keep her anchored to the present. Her reflection in the chrome tap wavered slightly, not lagging now, just trembling with the tiny movements of her hands. You have been trying to live as a ghost in your own life, the narrator continues gently, standing behind the glass of your models, watching the water move, pretending that you are not in the picture at all. But you are. You were there when the decisions were made, and you are here now. Mara let her head drop forward, eyes closing, shoulders curving inward as if to protect something soft and scared inside her chest. A sound rose in her throat that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh. A thin, frayed exhale that said, I am so tired. It's all my fault, she whispered, the words escaping before she could dress them in technical language. As soon as they were out, they sounded too big, too absolute, like a verdict carved into stone. The narrator lets the silence sit there on purpose, lets the listener feel how heavy that sentence is. Then carefully, like placing a hand on someone's shoulder in the dark. No, not all your fault. You are part of what happened, but you are not the only part. Your grief is not a crime. Your pain is not something to be punished. It is something to be witnessed. Something inside her loosened at that, as if a hidden valve had cracked open. She felt tears prick at her eyes, hot and unexpected, not dramatic, just there, like groundwater finally reaching the surface. You have been carrying this alone, the voice continues, because you thought that was the price of being responsible. But responsibility does not mean erasing yourself. It does not mean pretending you do not hurt. Her hand found the recorder again, fingers wrapping around the familiar battered shape. This little device had become her confessional, her excuse, her haunted mirror, the place where her professional notes and her private guilt had tangled together. How many times, the narrator asked softly, have you pressed play, not because you needed data, but because you needed to hear if the water would forgive you? Mara's thumb rested on the play button. For a moment, she almost did it, almost let another echo roll through the pipes, another not quite word bleed into the noise, another night of listening for a verdict that never came. Instead, she took a breath, then another, slow, uneven, with little catches in the middle where the feelings snagged. You cannot wash away the past, the voice says, but you can choose what you carry forward. And right now, standing in this humming, breathing room, you have a choice. The grounded action was simple. There was no ritual circle, no incantation, no dramatic proclamation, just a sink, a tap, and a small city-issued recorder that had held too many echoes. She turned the faucet. Water hissed and then poured from the tap, clear and cold, rushing into the basin with a familiar, gentle roar. The sound filled the room, another layer in the lab's mechanical respiration, a small, domesticated waterfall inside the concrete. Mara held the recorder over the stream for a moment, watching the droplets splash against its scuffed casing, watching tiny beads form and run down the plastic like passing thoughts. Her hand shook, not violently, just enough to make the reflected light jitter on the wet surface. "This won't change what happened," she murmured, half to herself, half to the unseen presence she still felt in the pipes. "It won't bring anyone back." "No," the narrator answers quietly, "it won't. Justice in your life will never look like rewinding time, but it can look like refusing to be the ghost of your own story any longer." Her fingers tightened. With a small, decisive motion that felt much larger inside her chest, she let the recorder fall from her hand. It dropped into the stream, bounced once on the porcelain, and then settled under the running water, its little red light still blinking as the sound of the sink roared in its microphone. For a few seconds, it fought back, emitting a thin, crackling hiss, a distorted squeal as the circuitry drowned. Then the light flickered, dimmed, and went out, leaving only the steady rush of water. The last artifact was the sound of itself, ending. Mara watched, breathing in ragged, inconsistent waves, as if learning how to sync with a different rhythm. Tears slid down her cheeks now, unnoticed, mingling with the spray on her face. "You have just done something real," the narrator says, almost reverent. "Not symbolic in your head, not theoretical on a map, but concrete, physical here. You chose to stop listening to punishment dressed up as data." Slowly, she reached out and turned the tap off. The water tapered to a trickle, then to a drip, then stopped, leaving the basin full and quiet. The recorder resting at the bottom like a small dark stone. The building's deeper hum returned to the foreground, no longer quite so menacing, just a tired creature breathing in its sleep. Mara wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, the gesture awkward, almost childlike. Her shoulders, which had been hunched toward her ears for so long she barely noticed, began to drop, a fraction, then a fraction more. "You are allowed to grieve," the voice tells her, and the listener, gently. "You are allowed to feel the weight of what has happened and still choose to go on. You are not required to erase yourself to be useful or to be forgiven." She looked at the sink one last time, at the drowned recorder, at the still water that now held only silence. Then she turned away, not from the past, but from the endless loop of self-interrogation she had mistaken for responsibility. As she stepped back into the corridor, the lab felt different. Not lighter, exactly, but clearer, as if someone had finally opened a window in a room that had been closed for years. The hum of the pumps sounded less like a demand and more like a heartbeat she could live beside, instead of inside. The fetch, if it had ever been there at all, did not vanish in a flash or a scream. It simply stopped standing in front of her. It moved back to where it had always belonged, as a shadow that reminded her she was alive, not a sentence that said she deserved to drown. And for the first time in a very long time, Mara Kearney let herself imagine a future where she was more than the sum of her risk assessments, more than her worst day on the job, more than the echo of a storm. The shadows have been faced. The truth remains. You are safe, you are whole, and you are home. Notice your shoulders again. Let them drop. Notice the space behind your eyes. Let it soften. You have done enough for tonight. Relief does not need permission. Rest is allowed. Rest is deserved. Sleep well. Dream peacefully. And I'll be right here next time, waiting to share more with you. Good night.